Thanks, everyone, and sorry for being up here again. It's really time that we get on to more of the interaction part of the session, but I just thought it was relevant to talk about the IPBES Transformative Change Assessment that I've been involved with, and I especially want to talk about its relevance for this group. I think Nadia did a great job of introducing IPBES, and Pernilla also drew some links between Cali and the IPBES process. And likewise, Linn mentioned how the IPBES was actually kind of part of the decision-making, part of the negotiations for the Global Biodiversity Framework. So it's really interesting to see IPBES being used in that space, but the IPBES assessments go far beyond what they can do for an international policy process. And I think that's where this conversation, I tried to pitch this conversation for how we might make use of these assessments, but not just take it for granted what's being said here, but to think about how we might translate that into the work that we do and how we might speak back to the way that transformation is also being framed here, because I'm not saying that this is the only way to think about it. So I think what's really important with this assessment, like other assessments that precede it, especially the global assessment and the values assessment, is to just zoom out a bit and see what's happening here. So for me, IPBES assessments, what they can do is really shift the conversation, like provide legitimacy for topics that actually might be quite controversial, that governments might want to shy away from. So the fact that we have a transformative change assessment, I think is kind of, radical actually. And this is something that is commissioned by the governments, recognizing that we need transformation, that we can't just carry on with business as usual. So what the government's tasked us with was to address the underlying drivers of biodiversity loss. And so this is not just about recognizing that transformation is necessary, but also that it's cross-cutting, and that we were tasked with understanding what transformation is and how to do it. But I think it's worth looking at it in the light of the Nexus assessment as well, that we're not just talking about transformation to address biodiversity loss, but also, for example, climate change and other social challenges that we're facing. So I think what these cartoons demonstrate, for me at least, is how broad transformation is as a topic. I'm using IPBES slides here. What I'm cautious of, I think, is that transformation does not just become another buzzword, and especially does not become like a complexity blinder, essentially. Okay, we'll just do transformation then. How simple is that? That's not the point at all. It's to recognize how interconnected it all is, especially when we look at the underlying drivers. And so another thing that we can do when we zoom out is to think about how powerful I think it is, like legitimating these kind of messages that we might not otherwise see in these kinds of spaces, so as either a science policy interface or even in the context of a multilateral process, to have like really key drivers such as the domination over nature and the concentration of power kind of called out and like drawing attention to those, because I don't know about you, but in my work we're often kind of beating about the bush, aren't we? Like not or obfuscating because we think that these kind of messages are not going to hold sway or they're not going to be politically palatable. But here you have it. All of you can make use of this now. The IPBES Transformative Change Assessment calls out these issues, and now you can reference them in your work and draw from that and using it as a starting point. I think that's really important, especially in these times as well, right? When you've got this kind of thing being shown to us in the news on a daily basis. So what is transformation then? And what the the assessment is showing is a new definition. So most previous definitions of transformation emphasize a change in systems or structures, a fundamental change, this kind of thing. What the transformative change assessment does is propose a definition that is actually much more straightforward, that transformation is a change in views, structures, and practices. So that's ways that we think, it's how we organize ourselves as societies, and it's also how we behave and how we act. So according to the assessment, I'm not saying you have to take this as a given, but if you see changes across those three kind of slices of life, if you like, then that is potentially transformative. But again, we're not just talking about change in any kind of direction. We see transformation happening now. That's not the kind of change that we want, is it? So we're also talking about, sorry, I speak for myself. So this is like guardrails, essentially, like to define, okay, well, what kinds of transformation do we want? So these are transformations that include equity and justice, pluralism and inclusion, respectful and reciprocal human nature relationships, and adaptive learning and action. And I think even from the talks that we heard so far today, the speed talks, you can see how the Focali work, people in this room are already addressing these issues, which I think is really exciting. So we obviously have so much to say within this room to these findings. And then the chapter that I was part of in the assessment was chapter 3, how does transformation occur? So drawing together what knowledge exists already on different theories and frameworks of transformation. And Carlos, your work was talking about weaving together different approaches and knowledges, and the transformative change assessment says that we can have change along different avenues. We can draw from different theories, different approaches, whether it be systemic or structural, inner transformations, empowerment, or a kind of knowledge interface kind of transformation as well, like co-production, for example. But it's most powerful when you draw together different kinds of approaches. One thing that I think is really interesting to think about now going forward is actually how do you do that weaving process that is, we can't just bundle it together. So it would be really interesting to talk later. Right, so I just want to focus on some specific things that I think are especially relevant to this group. As I said, I'm working from slides that IPBES itself has developed. I hope that they don't seem too simplistic, but I think what is important is the strategies that are proposed. There are 5 strategies, and then also what roles are kind of called for from different groups. So there's 5 strategies that are proposed to kind of further or to make more applicable or more practical this transformative change assessment are the let's do conservation, but let's do it right. So let's make sure that it's properly informed and resourced, and especially recognizing the crucial role played by indigenous peoples and local communities in stewardship of ecosystems. And then I guess this is again getting to the heart of the matter about the underlying drivers, so making sure there is a concerted effort to address the sectors that are doing the most damage to biodiversity. Whether that be agriculture, forestry, mining, etc. And then again, the next strategy is actually to address the financial system, so the dominant economic and financial paradigms. So I, for example, have not spent a great deal of time focusing on this. I think we would all recognize that it's absolutely vital. I would hope that this provides a kind of launching pad for people to say, yeah, there is work here that's not being done. The next strategy is about inclusive governance, making sure that governance systems are accountable, that they're adaptive, and that they include diverse stakeholders in the process. And then finally, to think about how we change values, views, so the ways we think, essentially, the ways that we value, getting away from those dominant values about materialism and individualism and so on. So then finally, the roles that are called for by the assessment, okay, well, what do I do kind of thing? So there are roles for governments, especially on strong and effective regulation, on innovation as well. So it's not just kind of telling people what not to do, but provide kind of enabling frameworks in the right direction as well. And then also, of course, to phase out harmful subsidies. So the next one, and this talks to the work that Torsten and colleagues are doing, is about supporting environmental defenders. I think some parts of the conservation kind of sector have not been very good at forging those alliances and making sure that they are supporting environmental defenders. You talked about violence, right? So this is another way in which the assessment is hopefully moving the conversation forward. We're not just kind of sticking in our comfort zone, sticking to the safe areas, but actually making sure we're supporting people who are right at the front line. And then finally, to recognize the critical role of social movements as well. And in the context of governments which are kind of shutting down on protest, this seems especially relevant today. So I would hope by presenting these kinds of findings that it's not just the findings themselves that I think are important, that might seem, fairly obvious to you, depending on where you're coming from, but also to recognize the context in which these findings are being put forward, that IPBES is a kind of legitimizing process for putting these kinds of things into the public eye. The question then, of course, is how to operationalize that, and IPBES itself is developing materials. For example, these kind of guiding questions. How can we essentially act on these different findings? How can I incorporate them into my work? But I would say there's far more that can be done that goes beyond these guiding questions, far more to thinking about, okay, well, to what extent is my work already transformative? I think hopefully what it does is provoke new ways of thinking as well, new projects, new scales of action, new collaborations and coalitions, that kind of thing. And Nadia mentioned knowledge brokering in her presentation. I think what's really important as well is that it's not just kind of taking the results of the assessment from on high as if they were a kind of, gospel that we all need to preach, but actually, okay, well, what does this mean in the context in which I work? So it's more of a two-way dialogue as well. And Nadia mentioned the work that she did in a previous assessment. Okay, well, what's in this for Africa? I think we could also ask those kinds of questions as well. What's in this for Focali, and how might we like to work with, but also modify these findings to, advance what we are doing? That's all I have for now. Thank you.